You fall asleep every night without thinking about it. It feels automatic, almost meaningless. You close your eyes, your thoughts slow down, and then you simply disappear for a few hours. But what most people don't realize is that sleep is not a passive state. Your brain does not shut off. It becomes one of the most active organs in your body. It repairs itself, reorganizes memories, clears waste, resets chemical balance, and prepares you for the next day of consciousness. Now imagine taking that away. Not for an hour, not for a nap, but completely removing sleep and watching what happens to the human brain as time stretches forward. This is not just about feeling tired. This is about watching the control center of your entire identity slowly lose stability. Your emotions, your memory, your perception of reality, even your sense of self begins to shift. And it starts sooner than most people think. Within just 16 to 24 hours, your brain is already changing in measurable ways. At first, it feels manageable. You are awake for a full day. Maybe you stayed up late working, studying, or scrolling without noticing the time. You feel a bit foggy, but still functional. You can talk, respond, and think in complete sentences. But inside your brain, something important is already happening. Neurons that normally communicate with perfect timing begin to slow down. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making and focus, starts to lose efficiency. At the same time, the amygdala, the emotional center, becomes slightly more reactive. This is why small things start to feel bigger than they should. A simple comment feels sharper. A minor inconvenience feels more frustrating. Your emotional control is already weakening. Meanwhile, your attention system begins to fracture. You start reading the same sentence twice. You forget why you walked into a room. You zone out for seconds at a time without realizing it. Your brain is trying to compensate by releasing stress hormones like cortisol and increasing alertness chemicals like dopamine and adrenaline. In short bursts, this works. It keeps you awake. It masks fatigue. But it is not sustainable. As you move into the second day without sleep, the cracks become harder to ignore. Around 24 to 36 hours, your cognitive performance begins to resemble mild intoxication. Reaction time slows significantly. Decision-making becomes less accurate. Your ability to judge risk starts to weaken. But the most noticeable change is in your perception of reality itself. Your brain relies on sleep to maintain the boundary between internal thoughts and external reality. Without sleep, that boundary begins to blur. You may catch yourself misinterpreting sounds or seeing movement in your peripheral vision that isn't actually there. These are early signs of microsleeps beginning to appear. Microsleeps are one of the most dangerous effects of sleep deprivation. They are brief, uncontrollable episodes where the brain shuts down for a few seconds while the body remains awake. You don't experience them as falling asleep. You experience them as blank gaps in time. You might be staring at a screen and suddenly realize you don't remember the last few seconds. You might be driving and suddenly notice you drifted slightly without remembering the motion. At this stage, your brain is desperately trying to protect itself. When sleep is not available, it forces micro-rests wherever possible. By the time you reach 48 hours without sleep, the situation changes dramatically. This is where sleep deprivation becomes dangerous on a neurological level. Your brain's glucose metabolism begins to slow. Glucose is the primary fuel source for neurons. When it becomes less efficiently processed, the brain literally starts running on reduced energy. The prefrontal cortex, already weakened, struggles even more to maintain logical thinking. You may find it difficult to organize thoughts into coherent sequences. Simple planning becomes overwhelming. At the same time, the amygdala becomes hyperactive. Emotional responses become exaggerated. Anxiety increases. Irritability becomes constant rather than occasional. You are not just tired anymore. You are unstable in small, subtle ways. Memory formation also begins to break down. The hippocampus, responsible for transferring short-term memories into long-term storage, becomes impaired. This means you may have conversations and forget them shortly afterward. You may read information and not retain it at all. Your brain is now prioritizing survival over accuracy. It is important to understand what that means. A well-rested brain is optimized for learning, reasoning, and prediction. A sleep-deprived brain is optimized for staying awake at any cost, even if that means sacrificing clarity, memory, and emotional stability. At around 48 hours, dopamine receptors also begin to become dysregulated. This can create strange fluctuations in mood. You may feel briefly energized, even euphoric, followed by sudden crashes into exhaustion or irritability. This instability is one reason why sleep deprivation has been historically used as a form of psychological stress in interrogation settings. The mind becomes more suggestible, more emotionally reactive, and less anchored in consistent reasoning. But even then, you are still conscious, still functioning, still pushing forward. That changes as you move deeper. At around 72 hours without sleep, the brain begins to enter a state that resembles severe neurological impairment. Cognitive performance now mirrors clinical levels of intoxication similar to high blood alcohol concentration. Speech may become disorganized. Thoughts may lose structure mid-sentence. Attention becomes fragmented to the point where sustained focus is nearly impossible. But the most disturbing shift begins in perception. Hallucinations can begin to emerge. These are not always dramatic or vivid at first. They often begin as distortions. Shadows seem slightly off, patterns appear to move when they are not moving. Sounds may seem to originate from places they should not. This happens because the brain is attempting to predict sensory input without enough rest to calibrate its internal models. When prediction errors accumulate, the brain begins to fill in gaps incorrectly. In other words, reality becomes partially constructed by assumption rather than accurate perception. The thalamus, which acts as a relay station for sensory information, becomes unreliable. The cortex, trying to interpret incomplete data, begins generating false interpretations. At this stage, emotional regulation is also severely compromised. Small stressor can trigger disproportionate reactions. A minor frustration can feel overwhelming. Anxiety can spike without clear reason. And underneath all of this, something even more critical is happening. The brain's waste clearance system, known as the glymphatic system, is not functioning properly. During sleep, your brain flushes out metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. Without sleep, this waste builds up. Some of these compounds are associated with neurotoxicity when they remain too long in brain tissue. You are essentially operating a system that is accumulating internal damage without repair. By the fourth day without sleep, the brain begins to show signs of severe functional breakdown. At this point, microsleeps become more frequent and harder to control. The brain will force shutdowns even while you are actively trying to stay awake. You may be in the middle of a conversation and suddenly lose track of reality for a few seconds. This is not a lapse in attention. It is involuntary neurological shutdown. Hallucinations can become more pronounced. Some individuals report seeing people who are not there, hearing voices, or experiencing vivid dream-like intrusions while awake. The boundary between waking and dreaming begins to dissolve. The default mode network, which is responsible for your sense of self and internal narrative, becomes unstable. This can lead to feelings of detachment from yourself, as if you are observing your own actions rather than fully controlling them. Memory fragmentation worsens. Entire periods of time may feel disconnected. You may struggle to reconstruct what you did an hour earlier. Emotionally, the brain becomes extremely reactive. Fear responses can be triggered easily. Paranoia may appear in some cases, even without external cause. The brain is trying to interpret increasingly unreliable internal signals as meaningful information. This is where sleep deprivation stops being just fatigue and becomes a state of altered consciousness. By day 5, the brain is no longer operating in a stable waking state. Most cognitive functions are significantly impaired. Language processing becomes slow, decision-making is unreliable, even basic tasks like preparing food or following instructions become error-prone. At this stage, the brain is heavily reliant on short bursts of stress hormones just to maintain wakefulness. But these hormones also contribute to further instability. cortisol levels remain elevated, which increases anxiety and further disrupts memory and focus. The brain is now in a loop of compensation that is beginning to fail. Hallucinations can become more complex and structured. Instead of simple distortions, the brain may generate fully formed scenes or figures. These are not dreams in the traditional sense, but dream intrusions into waking consciousness. Sleep deprivation at this level is considered medically dangerous. Even if a person remains awake, their brain is no longer functioning in a coherent, stable manner. By day 6, the distinction between reality and internal simulation becomes dangerously thin. The brain's sensory integration systems are no longer able to reliably distinguish external input from internally generated signals. This can result in persistent hallucinations, disorientation, and severe confusion. Motor coordination also deteriorates. The cerebellum, responsible for movement precision, becomes impaired. Simple physical tasks become clumsy. Balance may be affected. Reaction times are extremely delayed. Emotionally, the brain may swing between extreme agitation and emotional numbness. Some individuals report feeling disconnected from consequences, as if actions are happening without emotional weight attached. This is because the brain's reward and emotional circuits are no longer synchronizing properly. At this stage, the brain is not just sleep deprived. It is failing to maintain coherent conscious experience. By day 7 without sleep, the human brain is in a state of extreme neurological crisis. Sustained attention is nearly impossible. Memory formation is severely broken. Hallucinations may persist continuously. The individual may struggle to distinguish internal thoughts from external reality. Microsleeps become unavoidable and frequent. The brain will attempt to force recovery sleep even against conscious resistance. In laboratory settings, prolonged total sleep deprivation beyond this point is considered unsafe due to the risk of severe cognitive collapse, psychological breakdown, and physical health consequences. What is most striking at this stage is not just the loss of function, but the fragmentation of consciousness itself. The brain is essentially trying to operate without one of its most fundamental maintenance processes. Every system is affected, every function becomes unstable. And yet, the moment sleep is finally allowed, something remarkable happens. Recovery begins almost immediately. Within the first sleep cycle, the brain prioritizes deep restorative sleep stages. The glymphatic system activates aggressively, clearing accumulated waste. Neural communication stabilizes. Emotional regulation begins to return. Within a few nights of proper sleep, many of the cognitive impairments begin to reverse. This reveals something important. The brain is not fragile in the way we often assume. It is resilient, but it is also dependent on sleep in a way that is absolute. There is no substitute process that can fully replace it. Sleep is not rest in the passive sense. It is maintenance, repair, recalibration, and restoration of consciousness itself. When you stay awake long enough, you do not simply become tired. You begin to experience what happens when the system responsible for holding your mind together starts to fall out of balance. And the longer it continues, the more that balance slips away.